I'm impressed, Newberry." Dr. Alec Westwood sat back and took a lingered sip of vodka, admiring the small crowd of women scattered across Valley Tavern. Unfortunately for his sake, the majority of its beauties were engrossed in conversations, which was not exactly what he had envisioned, but not at all to his surprise. He didn't imagine there were too many upstanding women in North Conway who enjoyed being hit on at 9 o'clock in the evening. He turned to the man seated across from him. "You've managed to find us a leisure activity that's held my interest for well more than 15 minutes. "Not a bad place, is it?" Ryan Newberry remarked. "My sources say this is the spot to check out if you're looking for a woman with the entire package: beauty, brains, and a killer behind." Alec chuckled. "That certainly does cover the bases. What more could a man ask for than a nice tight ass he can sink his teeth into?" "You make it sound so depraved." Ryan's smile indicated he was hardly offended. "All I'm doing is giving you a nudge in the right direction. You could just as well spend the 7th consecutive Saturday night planted in front of your plasma screen." "What's so bad about that?" Alec took a bite of his exceptionally tasty hors d'oeuvres, portobello mushrooms with Kalamata olives and sun-dried tomatoes. "Nothing," Ryan answered, "so long as you enjoy sleeping alone." "I've never had any shortage of women in my bed," Alec clarified. "Maybe not, but it must be pretty difficult to keep your dance card full when the majority of your companions aren't invited back for an encore." "If I find one I like long enough to keep around, you'll be the first to know." Alec grinned. "Not every woman is Abigail." "If you don't mind, I'd very much prefer to keep my wife out of this conversation." Ryan shifted in his chair. "Fair enough, though a woman of class does tend to carry herself a bit distinctly. Her hair is sleeker, her skin is softer, and she often smells of expensive perfume. Rose or lavender, something that promises passion and hints that she has money in the bank." "Good Lord," Ryan said rather loudly. "If you knew as much about doing a coronary artery bypass as you do about women, you'd probably be running Memorial Hospital by now." "Be glad that isn't the case, then," Alex said thoughtfully. Like his companions, his white coat, the only thing which labeled him professionally, sat safely outside on the passenger seat of his BMW, leaving him dressed in a simple shirt and tie complemented by a pair of slacks. Ryan had been Alec's best friend since the start of medical school, an especially difficult time in Alec's life. During that particular period, it had been critical to have someone with an appreciation for his circumstances to confide in. Ryan had only lived in North Conway a few years, but they'd shared a similar high-pressured upbringing. "How do you think you would feel if you really were the chief of staff?" Ryan asked. "Exactly the way I do now, only with a bigger ego to show for it," Alec answered honestly. "I'd be the same person, but people would see me differently, even Colin." He crumpled his napkin into a ball. "That bastard would have no choice. As his superior, I would have control over his every breath." Ryan nodded. "It's sort of difficult to picture you bossing your brother instead of the other way around." Alec finished the last of his drink. "It's infuriating, and unfortunately I don't see the circumstance improving itself any time soon." "The horrors of being one of the top 3 doctors in the OR, Ryan said with a hint of sarcasm. Alec dropped his voice. "I see your point, but you know I'd never have chosen such an egocentric career if I hadn't been so desperate to create a wholesome image." He angled his head, bringing his left thumb against his temple. "Kind of a waste, don't you think? You live to practice medicine." "True enough. Just the same, I could do without the Gestapo looking over my shoulder." "You'd feel differently if the situation were reversed." Ryan glanced in the direction of the entrance. "Colin may be a bit of a know-it-all, but he keeps you on your toes." "Yes," Alex said. "I suppose there's that to consider. I'd never have pushed so hard to succeed if the thought of surpassing Colin wasn't so damn enticing. He has a way of driving me to drink and urging me to work harder at the same time." Alec froze, catching sight of his brother as he came past a table with 2 pretty young women. The ladies brought their conversation to a halt as Colin cast them a grin. Steam rose in Alec's throat. Ryan, who'd insisted this evening's purpose was for Alec to pick up women, had undoubtedly been planning this family reunion from the start. "I didn't realize we were expecting company," he said gruffly. "If you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with Dr. Curtis." "I thought that meeting was canceled." Colin pulled up a chair. "Never could understand why Curtis schedules meetings so late in the day. His old-school practices are what's keeping Memorial Hospital from moving into the 21st century. It's a wonder a top-notch surgeon like you has to attend meetings at all, Alex said dryly. They seem like a waste of time for a doctor who already knows everything. Colin chuckled. Yes, I did make that point to Curtis myself. He's dead set in his archaic ways. I'm afraid we're just going to have to humor the guy until he retires and the board promotes someone with a fresher approach. I wonder which doctor you have in mind for that, Alec muttered. Why wait the 2 years? Make your case to the board and maybe you can just take the spot now. Alec, chill out, man, Ryan said. You know, that isn't a bad idea. Maybe I'll have a talk with Felicity tomorrow. Colin's smirk indicated he was already undressing the doctor's shapely young daughter in his mind. I hear she already persuaded Sims to let Curtis go a year earlier than planned. She'd probably speak up again if I made it worth her while. Alec clenched his jaw. God knows there's a card you've never played before. What's the matter, Colin? Don't think you can get the job based on your incredible charm and incomparable medical skills? Or are you afraid someone else on staff might actually have the balls to challenge you? He tightened his fist with the heat of 29 years of pent-up anger. Why do this thing behind closed doors? Unless, of course, you're worried that everyone might finally see what an arrogant son of a bitch you really are. He felt as if half the restaurant was staring at him, and yet he hardly cared. He'd spent his entire life living in Colin's shadow, trying to measure up to the image of a man who believed himself to be more important than God. It wasn't only himself he was thinking of. It was every person working at Memorial Hospital who had the unfortunate luck of having to associate with Colin. The man made no secret that he thought himself some sort of a hero, a white knight whom Alec and everyone else in his vicinity couldn't possibly survive without. Colin was there to lend a hand in times of trouble, but he never let the people he helped forget it. Alec was done letting his jerk of a brother believe he considered himself one of those helpless, indebted souls. He stood and loosened his collar. I'm going for some air. You all right? Colin asked. You don't look well. I'm fine. Alec tossed a 50 onto the table. Don't wait up. In the next room, the bar was alive with the sounds of conversation. Alec spotted a lone stool positioned at the furthest corner of the counter and took it. He'd lost his appetite for fox hunting, but for the sake of proving that the evening wasn't a total loss, he'd stick around for the duration of one drink. He signaled for the bartender to acknowledge him, thinking back on his conversation with Colin, which he was sure had drawn the attention of every person within 100 feet. Chief of Staff, the bastard actually saw himself as the next Chief of Staff, and he didn't plan on waiting long, apparently. If Colin's agenda came together as quickly as he was implying, the world would be turned on its head within a year. The man sitting on the next bar stool laughed loudly, and Alec sighed. He waved his hand in hopes of being served. His infuriated persona was probably frightening off every person who wasn't drunk enough to be seeing two of him. The bartender, a petite blonde who couldn't have been much older than 22, shot Alec a flirtatious smile. He perked up, replying with a wink and a smile of his own. He asked her for a Glenfiddich. She disappeared to the opposite corner of the bar, then returned a moment later with his glass. Relief flooded Alec's insides as he took a long, satisfying swallow. The scotch tasted cool against the inside of his mouth, and he finished the rest in one gulp. Remembering his plan to salvage some of the evening, he swore under his breath. Shaking his head, he opened his wallet, and a stunningly beautiful woman sitting on the opposite side of the bar caught his eye. Her soft white fingers, wrapped around a glass of wine, were trembling. It didn't seem as if she'd sat in a place like this a night in her life. She caught his gaze, and her hazel eyes opened so widely he almost went over and asked her what was wrong. He was consumed with the strangest desire to take her in his arms and hold her until she was no longer afraid. The girl's fearful eyes locked with his. With them fixed on him, she tossed a few dollars onto the counter, then slid from her bar stool. She looked toward the entrance, as if expecting someone she knew to come walking through the door. When no one did, she made her way toward the back hall. Alec hesitated. The young woman had come there alone, which, under typical circumstances, would have implied she was there in search of a good time. Women who put out without a good deal of effort on their pursuers' parts didn't generally interest him, but he had a feeling this one had wandered out of her element. As he hurried from the bar, the woman in the white lacy dress, which hugged her delicate curves in just the right places, seemed to command the attention of every man in the room. He watched with fascination as her silky brown hair bounced with each hurried footstep. It wasn't difficult to imagine himself running his fingers through that satin texture. The thought of doing it made him uncontrollably hot and hard. He got to his feet, making a dash for the exit. "Excuse me." He stepped into the small, dark corridor. "You seem pretty upset. Is there anything I can do?" The girl stopped short. She turned around. The fear on her face was replaced by a smile. "I should think a man like you is used to making women nervous." She didn't seem afraid at all. Maybe she never had been, and this was all an exaggerated game intended to lure him from the crowd. Alec liked the idea of that. He'd never been enticed by such an aggressive woman before, but this stunning little vision wasn't like anyone he had ever encountered. He moved closer to her. She had long, dark eyelashes which brought his attention to her eyes as she blinked. Her lips were pink, soft and delicate. She moistened them with the tip of her tongue. He looked back to be sure no one had followed them. "You aren't exactly your average barfly." His voice was barely above a whisper. The young woman offered a warm smile. As she rested her palm against the patch of skin between his collarbone and the open buttons of his shirt, her eyes grew wild with mischief. She brought her other hand against the nape of his neck. The surprise of what she was doing melted as their lips touched. Her mouth moved over Alec's, lulling him into a trance. She tasted of wine and vanilla. He returned her kiss, sliding his tongue against her bottom lip. He held her silhouette against his torso and kissed her until the evidence of his desire was so clear she couldn't possibly mistake it. When she pulled away, he was breathless and didn't immediately notice the change in her stance. The fearful woman, clutching her drink, slowly replaced the nervy vixen who'd just kissed a stranger in a dark hallway. She caught his eye, and her naughty smile returned. Her face was flushed. He could tell she was hiding something. The unusual pendant the woman was wearing caught the glint of the moon shining through the window behind them. Alec's heart stopped beating. The necklace was an amulet, encasing a very distinct picture of a cougar. It was the symbol used by the organization that had recruited him 10 years ago. Alec inhaled sharply. He put a hand over his mouth and tried to think. The viewing of the woman's high-peaked breasts was making it rather difficult to do that. He had either just kissed a girl working for a group of men who intended to kill him, or else she'd been sent to do the job herself. With the knowledge that his life was on the line, his body began to cool down. He thought fast, deciding that he would ask her to get a room with him at the hotel across the street. In a secluded area, he could take her down without making a scene. "Care to join me someplace more private?" He brushed his fingertips along the groove of her neck. She laughed, the soft sound warming the room. "I'm game if you are." The woman slipped her hand into his. Her scent, which reminded him of freshly cut orchids, flooded his senses. He felt the primitive need to devour her returning. Good God! He had always considered himself to be a sensible man who valued his own life, but apparently he'd overestimated the strength of his own willpower. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered as he led her past the bar. Her voice was husky, hinting of suggestion. Her hand was warm in his. Alec offered a secretive grin. "It's a surprise." Her smile widened, and she arched her dark eyebrows. "I like surprises." "I imagine you do." He pressed a kiss to the surface of her hand. "You won't be disappointed." Fluttering her lashes as they stepped through the door, the young woman let a hand linger against his mouth. It was as though she was requesting that he continue to explore her satin skin. The moonlight made her lips seem darker, a sweet, tempting red. There was this loose strand of brown silk hanging just shy of her ear. Alec was dying to touch it, to explore every last inch of her body. He struggled to keep his focus as they approached the hotel. "Are you prepared to do this?" the woman asked. "Sweetheart, I couldn't be more ready." For a second, he thought he frightened her off with his quick response. Then she laughed. "I meant, do you have protection?" "Oh." Alec bit his tongue. He ought to have known that was what she meant, though protection seemed like kind of a waste when this was only a decoy. She drew back. "I have something in my glove compartment. Meet you here in 10? 5. He pressed a kiss to her cheek. "Don't keep me waiting." I'll be back in a jiffy." That smile was wickedly seductive. Alec kept one eye on the woman as she disappeared around the corner. Smiling, he almost began to forget this was an act. He struggled to remind himself the young woman had very likely gone to tell her boss that he was standing in the middle of the street, a sitting duck waiting to be taken out. He looked up as a car came down the road. His heart skipped a beat. He held his breath. The car passed, and Alec breathed a sigh of relief. Shaking his head, he entered the hotel lobby. He would wait there, in public, for the woman to return. He took a seat on the leather sofa that faced the window. Alec stretched his legs, focusing on the passing cars. As he sat, he listened to the ticking of the clock above the fireplace. The sound of a gong startled him as the clock struck 11. The revolving door turned, but it was an older gentleman, not his mystery woman, who stepped through. Unable to wait a moment longer, he stood and walked outside. The street was dark and quiet. Most of the cars that had been parked in front of Valley Tavern were now gone. Alec scanned the area. Finding no one lurking around, he walked up the block and down each of the side streets that ran perpendicular to it. He entered the restaurant and asked the hostess if she'd seen a pretty brunette woman wearing a white dress. She said she hadn't, not that his description had given her much to go by. Walking back to his car, something he'd been trying to deny struck Alec hard. His mystery woman wasn't looking for him at all. This had been a setup, a test intended to feel him out. Now that they knew where he was, those men were going to let him live in fear. Then, when he least expected it, they would have their revenge. He was quite possibly the greatest fool that had ever lived, and if he didn't get the hell out of there, that might not continue to be the case for much longer. Opening the door to his BMW, Alec checked briefly to make sure no one had followed him. A dead man walking, he sped off into the night.